We're beginning Chapter 12, Merck, where the patients die first. On September 30th, 2004, Merck withdrew its ch13 inhibitor, the anti-arthritis drug Vioxx rifacoxib, from the market. I was in Canada and browsed the TV stations to induce natural sleep when I learned about it on Fox News. What was more surprising to me than the withdrawal of the drug was that the president of the U.S. Arthritis Foundation lamented for about 10 minutes about what a great loss it was for patients that Vioxx was no longer available. If I hadn't known who was speaking, I would have guessed it was the CEO of Merck. Company talk all over. For a full 10 minutes. I usually get 30 seconds when I'm on the news. This speaks volumes about the extent to which patient organizations collude with Big Pharma. I checked the website for the Arthritis Foundation and it had Pfizer's logo on its opening page. In contrast to the foundation's hype about the drug, the jury in a court case stated that Merck showed malicious, oppressive, and outrageous conduct and found it guilty of 4 counts of fraud in marketing rifacoxib. It was known right from the start that COX-2 inhibitors, via their mechanism of action, must increase the risk of thrombosis. In 1996, Merck scientists discussed the heart attack risk, and investigators sponsored by Merck found that Vioxx reduced urinary metabolites of protosilin in healthy volunteers by about half, which indicates that Vioxx causes thrombosis. However, Merck convinced the authors to change what they had written into meaningless sentence. COX-2 may play a role in a systemic biosynthesis of protosilin. Also, in 1997, a Merck scientist said that if they didn't allow patients to use aspirin in their trials, which decreased the risk of a heart attack, patients on Vioxx might have more heart attacks, and that would kill the drug. Merck surely concealed how dangerous Vioxx was. A senior Merck scientist proposed to leave out people with a high risk of cardiovascular problems in the company's planned VIGOR study, so that the difference in heart complications between Vioxx and other NSAIDs would not be evident. None of the trials in the FDA's submission were designed to evaluate the cardiovascular risk. As mentioned in Chapter 10, FDA also had serious concerns about the drug. When the FDA approved rifacoxib for marketing in May 1999, despite disconcerting evidence in the application, it stated that it lacked complete certainty that the drug increased cardiovascular risk. I find this extraordinary. Imagine how absurd it would be if a doctor said to a patient, "I'm not completely sure that this drug might kill you, so please take it." If there had been patient representatives in the advisory committee, they would probably have rejected the application and demanded of Merck that it tested its drug more carefully, as it was clear that the drug must cause thrombosis. Further, as there were many other NSAIDs on the market, the drug wasn't needed. The scandal of the COX-2 inhibitor is really monumental. The drugs were approved based on small, short-term trials that didn't look for cardiovascular harms in patients with a low risk for such events, although nearly half of real-world patients with arthritis have coexisting cardiovascular disease. Merck did conduct 2 trials, however, Trial 090 and VIGOR, that both showed that rifacoxib increased cardiovascular events. Trial 090 ended in 1999, but wasn't published until 2006. 2 years after Vioxx had been withdrawn when the publication couldn't harm the sales. The other trial, with the catchy name Vigor, was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2000. It compared Vioxx with naproxen. A year later, pharmacist Jennifer Harkovic called a radio show on which the journal's editor, Jeffrey Drazen, appeared and begged him to correct the paper because there were 3 more heart attacks on Refacoxib on the FDA's website than in the journal's article. But Drazen responded evasively. 2 months earlier than in the journal, 2 months earlier, how did I say that before? Haravok, that's what I'm saying, had sent a letter to the journal, but it was rejected officially because of lack of space, which is an excuse respectable journals cannot hide behind when scientific misconduct relevant for patient safety is suspected. The Vigor trial would have looked very different if the 3 extra heart attacks had not been deliberately omitted from the trial report. Their inclusion would have also undermined the assertion in the article that only those who were already at a high risk of heart attack showed an increased risk after taking Vioxx, as the omitted heart attacks were all in the low risk group. There were other editorial blunders. The editors didn't ensure that thrombosis were appropriately described and discussed. There were 2 full tables of gastrointestinal adverse effects in the article, but no table of thrombosis. They were only mentioned in a few lines of text and only as percentages, which made it impossible to calculate the true number of events, as not all of them were included. Based on the percentages, I calculated 32 versus 17 thrombotic events on Vioxx and naproxen, respectively. But there were actually another 15 heart attacks on Vioxx that was coded as something else, and conversely, 2 deaths too many on naproxen. Thus, the coding of the events favored Vioxx, and many more events disappeared on Vioxx than on naproxen in the published report. This looks like fraud to me. The editors allowed Merck to say that the reason the Vioxx caused more thrombosis than naproxen was that naproxen was protective rather than Vioxx being harmful. This interpretation was wholly speculative and later refuted, and it was irrelevant for the patients, as there were more serious events overall with Vioxx. There could be no doubt that naproxen was the better drug. The editors noted that forensic IT work on the submitted disc revealed that the 3 cases of myocardial infarction had been omitted from the manuscript 2 days before it was submitted to the journal. It's fascinating what words I don't mess up. They also found that Merck had selected an earlier cutoff date shortly before the trial ended for the thrombotic events than the cutoff date for the gastrointestinal events, which they were not informed about and which is deceitful. They blame Merck and the clinical investigators, but forgot to mention their own role in allowing the obviously flawed paper to appear in print. After 5 years of silence, when the drug had been withdrawn and the journal ran a risk of getting accused in court cases, the editors finally reacted by publishing the expression of concern. If they had acted earlier, it might have killed the sales of Vioxx instead of killing the patients, as the journal is so influential, and it would also have blunted the impact of the reprint sales. The New England Journal of Medicine sold 929,400 reprints of the article, more than one for every doctor in the country, and they brought in between $697,000 and $836,000. The journal won't disclose its revenue, but its owner, Massachusetts Medical Society, listed $88 million in total publishing revenue for the year ending May 31st, 2005. In 2001, independent researchers using FDA data documented that Vioxx doubled the risk of serious cardiovascular events significantly in the Vigor trial, 8,076 patients. And in 2004, a meta-analysis performed by independent researchers showed that a clear relationship between Vioxx and increased risk of myocardial infarction existed already by the end of 2000. When this meta-analysis was published, the French Drug Agency felt it could be interpreted as an accusation of their own incompetence. They therefore wrote a letter to the editor. They therefore wrote a letter to the editor to defend themselves, which ironically demonstrated their incompetence. They claimed also there was no evidence of an increased risk before 2005 and put forward Merck's false explanation for the reason Vioxx caused more thromboses than naproxen was that naproxen was protective rather than Vioxx being harmful. Sometimes it's better to keep quiet with one's ignorance. The rest of the world, including the FDA, had known since 1999 that Vioxx could cause thrombosis. Two other meta-analyses from 2001 and 2002, one with 28,465 patients and the other with 5,035 patients, didn't find an increase in cardiovascular risk with Vioxx compared with placebo, which is highly surprising given the huge number of patients, but not given that all the authors were employees or paid consultants for Merck. It is telling that the two meta-analyses performed by the independent researchers were published in JAMA and The Lancet, whereas those performed by Merck were published in special journals, Circulation and the American Journal of Cardiology. Circulation is owned by the American Heart Association, which accepts drug company sponsorship over a 10-year period. The association funded more than $1 billion in research grants. This amount is surreal for a non-American. The website of the American Journal of Cardiology advertises many free CME programs and, like Circulation, it also publishes supplements to the journal. The first supplement I came across was a paper that, under acknowledgement, said that funding for publication and medical writing assistance were provided by Novo Nordisk Incorporated, even in 2012. We are told about medical writing assistance, which means that the paper wasn't written by its 8 authors, but by a ghost. Internal company documents showed that Merck in 2003 got away with publishing a huge seeding trial, the Advantage trial, which involved 600 sites and 5,557 patients in a prestigious journal, Annals of Internal Medicine. It compared Vioxx with naproxen, and, as in the Vigor trial, scientific misconduct was involved. 8 patients suffered heart attacks or sudden cardiac death on Vioxx, compared only with 1 on naproxen. But in the publication, 3 of the Vioxx cases had disappeared, so that the difference was no longer statistically significant. As an example, one of Merck's scientists who had judged that a woman died from a heart attack was overruled by his boss, so that we won't raise concerns. The cause of death was now called unknown. Also in Merck's report to the FDA, Merck's top scientist, Edward Sholnick, noted in emails that he would personally pressure senior officials at the FDA if it took action against Vioxx. The first author on the trial report said that Merck came to him after the study was completed and asked him to help with the editing. He was paid, which is highly unusual for a first time author of a trial report, and the report was already written up by Merck. A Merck employee was thanked for assistance with manuscript preparation. It confirms that we cannot trust drug companies, that an independent meta-analysis of Vioxx studies found that those with an external endpoint committee reported 4 times more heart attacks with Vioxx than with the comparator, whereas trials without an external endpoint committee reported fewer heart attacks with Vioxx. Although the members of data safety monitoring boards in drug trials are supposed to be independent. Even according to Merck's own policy, the head of the Vigor Board was awarded a 2-year consulting contract with Merck 2 weeks before the Vigor trial ended, and he disclosed family ownership of Merck shares worth $70,000. Before Vigor was published in 2000, Chief Scientist Edward Sholnick admitted internally that Vioxx causes thromboses. Internal company documents show that Merck used guest and ghost authors for many of its papers to investigate to which extent the medical literature is flawed and misleads the clinicians. We studied 397 abstracts on Vioxx. It was expected from the beginning that the drug would be a double-edged sword compared to older NSAIDs. In other words, causing less gastrointestinal bleeding and more thrombosis. From the patient's point of view, both effects are important and should be investigated, emphasized and reported similarly. However, before the withdrawal of Vioxx, 3.4 times as many abstracts commented on gastrointestinal bleeding as those that commented on thrombotic effects. Whereas after withdrawal, 1.8 times as many abstracts commented on thrombotic effects. Thus, the harms of Vioxx came into focal too late when the drug had been withdrawn. Merck also misled the readers by publishing a fake journal, the Australian Journal of Bone and Joint Medicine, which looked like a peer-reviewed medical journal, but was a marketing tool. Most of its authors presented data favorable to Merck products, including Vioxx, without disclosing the sponsorship. Like Merck, the FDA failed badly in its duty toward the patients. A 5 times increase in heart attacks in the millions of people taking the drug wasn't a public health emergency in the FDA's eyes. Life-saving revisions of the Vioxx label took nearly 2 years to complete. We were trying to work out exactly what was acceptable to both sides. I wonder what the thousands of grief-stricken spouses who lost their loved ones during these 2 years will say about this tempo in the drug regulation. Many of the tens of thousands of patients who were killed by Vioxx shouldn't have been treated with an NSAID, a paracetamol, acetaminophen, would have given the same effect, or as they could have done well without treatment. In February 2001, the FDA discussed the Vigor study with Merck because of the 5-fold increase in myocardial infarction with rifacoxib in comparison with naproxen, and the FDA asked to make the doctors aware of these results. However, the next day, Merck instructed its sales force of more than 3,000 people, do not initiate discussion on the FDA Arthritis Advisory Committee or the results of the Vigor study. If a physician inquired about Vigor, the salesperson should indicate that the study showed a gastrointestinal benefit and then say, I cannot discuss the study with you. Merck also produced a pamphlet to its sales force indicating that rifacoxib was associated with 1/8 mortality from cardiovascular causes of that found with other NSAIDs. The pamphlet presented a misleading analysis of short term studies and did not include any data from the large vigor study. The card's two references included data on file at Merck and a brief research abstract. The corruption of the truth was total. In May 2001, Merck produced the press release. Merck confirms favorable cardiovascular safety of Vioxx. Drug salespeople were only allowed to discuss approved results with the doctors, which were studies that provided solid evidence as to why doctors should prescribe Merck products. Distributing studies that raised safety questions about Merck's drugs was a clear violation of company policy. A Merck spokesperson, Kenneth C. Frazier, lied when presented with senior Henry A. Waxman's unequivocal account of all these issues. He said that our representatives were instructed to present a balanced description of the risks and benefits of Vioxx, and that the data from the randomized trials involving more than 28,000 patients didn't show an increased risk with Vioxx. Waxman replied that it was telling that the company relied on its 28,000 patients meta-analysis, as the FDA already in 2001 found it to have serious methodical limitations. Eric Topol from Cleveland wrote about these issues 3 weeks after the withdrawal of Vioxx, and two Merck employees misinformed the readers in response. They claimed that the increase in cardiovascular risk began after 18 months of therapy. The marketing trick was widely believed at the time, even by clinical pharmacologists, who should have known better. I told them that when you take the first dose of the drug that is thrombogenic, you might get a thrombosis. Merck's misleading claim came from a trial in correcto. Merck's misleading claim from a trial in correcto adenomas, and they propagated it, surprise, surprise, in the abstract in the New England Journal of Medicine. Merck had not used the correct statistical test, and they had excluded all events that occurred more than 2 weeks after stopping treatment, although some of these patients would be expected to have and actually had thrombotic events. It took 15 months before Merck was forced to retract. Its claim from the journal. Topol wrote that harms were visibly early on, and that he showed that 2 deaths, 4 heart attacks, and 3 strokes with Vioxx were missing in the Vigor publication compared with the data the FDA had access to, whereas the total number of such events was the same for the comparator drug, naproxen. In the 2 datasets, more fraud, it seems. Trials in Alzheimer's disease were similarly revealing. Internal Merck analyses in April 2001 showed that Vioxx increased total mortality significantly by a factor of 3, but these analyses were not submitted to the FDA until 2 years later, and they were not made public. Merck continued to recruit patients in one of the trials, and an additional 2 years after it knew that Vioxx was deadly. Despite the deaths, the 2 published papers stated that Vioxx was well tolerated. That must be the most obscene interpretation that exists of a drug being well tolerated. But I accept that dead patients cannot complain about lack of tolerance. What Merck did was to discard all deaths that occurred more than 2 weeks after the patients got off the drug. For example, because of adverse effects in violation of Merck's own protocol that stated that such deaths should be included in the results. In fact, the risk of thrombosis may be increased a whole year after the patients come off the drug. Merck's spokespeople lied to the FDA and Congress about what and when the company knew that Vioxx is deadly. There were lies all over the place. 2 months after the withdrawal of Vioxx, the medical director of Merck in Sweden wrote in the Swedish Medical Journal that none of the trials before one of the adenomas from 2005 had shown an increased risk of Vioxx compared with placebo. The same year Merck pulled Refacoxib off the market, its CEO received performance-based bonuses worth over $36 million in addition to his base salary, and he was never indicted. Merck pleaded guilty in 2012 to criminal violation of federal law related to its promotion and marketing of Vioxx, and was to pay nearly $1 billion in a criminal fine and civic damages. In 2007, the company announced a settlement worth $4.85 billion. At that time, the company had already spent more than $1.2 billion on legal fees. The crimes involved off-label marketing of Vioxx and false statements about the drug's cardiovascular safety. In relation to our study of Vioxx abstracts, we registered the conditions, apart from arthritis, that Refacoxib was proposed for in 852 abstracts, although almost half of the abstracts were published after the withdrawal of Refacoxib, where there was no longer any interest in suggesting new indications for the drug. The number and variety of conditions for which an effect of Refacoxib was proposed was astounding, no less than 30. It was as if the drug, like Neuron, could be used for everything. For example, schizophrenia, sclerosis, 8 different cancers, and premenstrual acne. And yet, we only studied abstracts. There were likely more conditions mentioned in the main text of the papers. How many patients did Merck kill with Vioxx because of the thrombosis? In its trial of colorectal adenomas, Merck assessed thrombotic events, and there were 1.5 more cases of myocardial infarction, suddenly cardiac death, or stroke on Refacoxib than on placebo per 100 patients treated. More than 80 million patients have been treated with Refacoxib since about 10% of such events are fatal. A crude estimate is that Refacoxib has killed about 120,000 people. The patients were treated for 2.4 years on average, and as many patients in clinical practice are treated for shorter periods. This could be an overestimate. However, other factors tend to lead to underestimation. Only events that occurred within 2 weeks after the patient stopped their drug were recorded. Bye. And the patients were only 59 years of age on average, and at low risk of thrombotic events. This is a general problem with Merck's trials. Merck only included patients that had an unusually low risk of thrombosis. For example, medical patients in Tennessee treated with Refacoxib in clinical practice had a baseline risk of getting a myocardial infarction that was 8 times higher than that for the patients in the trials. I therefore believe, also considering that patients with arthritis are usually treated for years with NSAIDs, that my estimate of 120,000 deaths because of thrombosis is realistic. In addition, Vioxx has killed many thousands of patients because of ulcer complications. In 2006, I saw a TV commercial in the United States on CNN that ended with a very deep voice saying, "Merck, where the patients come first." I couldn't help thinking, Merck, where the patients die first. And that's it for that chapter. Chapter 14 next.